The river's cold water bit at her ankles, but Aita didn't flinch. She had come here to banish him, yet the wind whispered his name with a persistence that refused to leave her. Aita's hands trembled slightly as she held the herbs above the rippling water, the sun barely cresting the horizon, painting the desert hills in dull gold and amber. The river ran shallow but steady, carrying with it the memories she had tried so hard to bury. Every stone beneath the current felt alive with whispers of what could have been, or what should never be. She had heard the old women of her tribe say that the river carried away anger, sorrow and regret if one spoke their intentions clearly, and she had believed them. Aita's lips moved in a silent chant, murmuring words older than her own years. The pungent scent of sage and juniper floated around her, mingling with the earthy aroma of wet sand and stones. From the riverbank, a figure watched quietly, hidden among the willows and the sparse mesquite trees. Kiva's shadow stretched long under the rising sun. He had followed her at a distance since dawn, his spear resting lightly in one hand. Not out of curiosity, or at least not entirely. There was something about her presence that demanded attention, a quiet gravity that drew him forward despite himself. Aita raised her hands higher, scattering the herbs into the river with a careful flick. Water lapped at her ankles, cool and relentless, as if resisting her efforts to control it. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath, willing the river to carry her intentions far from herself, far from him. "Leave this place," she whispered into the wind. "Leave me." The words barely crossed her lips when Kiva stepped closer, the crunch of dry sand under his moccasins betraying his careful movements. Aita's eyes snapped open, scanning the riverbank, but he made no sound. He did not run. He did not retreat. Instead, he moved into the shallows and reached out, his hand steady and sure, despite the tension in his shoulders. Before she could react, his fingers closed around hers. The herbs floated past them, carried downstream, and for a moment, the river seemed to pause. "You cannot banish what is already here," Kiva said quietly, his voice low but firm, a strange mixture of respect and challenge. Aita's first instinct was to pull away, to recoil at the audacity of his presence. She had come to the river alone. She had prepared herself. She had everything under control. Or at least she had thought she did. And now he was here, anchored in the shallow current beside her, unyielding. I do not know what you mean," she stammered, though her voice betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Her pulse thumped in her ears as if the river itself had joined in, echoing the sudden rush of warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Kiva's gaze remained steady, fixed on hers without judgment, without mockery. There was no overt expression of feeling, no flirtation, no unnecessary charm. Only presence, only a silent insistence that he would not leave her to perform her ritual alone. "You came here to banish me," he said after a long moment. "But the river does not work on its own." Her grip on the pouch of herbs tightened, knuckles whitening. She could feel the strength of his hand around hers, firm but not cruel, insistent but not violent. And though she tried to pull away, her feet dug into the sandy riverbed, unwilling or unable to move past the invisible tether he had created. "You should leave," she repeated, sharper this time. Now he did not. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The river continued its endless journey, water sparkling in the morning light, scattering reflections across their faces. Aita's mind raced. This was not supposed to happen. She had prepared herself for solitude, for ritual, for the release of what had haunted her nights. And yet here he was, standing in the river beside her, the sun glinting off the wooden spear slung loosely across his back, his expression calm, unyielding. "You cannot banish the past," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Not by yourself." Aita's heart thudded against her ribs at the words, and she fought the impulse to shiver, not from the cold, but from the truth of them. The river had always been her ally, her sanctuary, and now, the man she sought to banish was entwined in its flow as surely as the waters themselves. She tried to wrench her hand free, but Kiva's grip did not falter. There was no force in it that sought to dominate, only a quiet strength that spoke of patience, resilience, and a presence that refused to leave her side. "You cannot stand in the river forever, Aita," he said. "You must either step forward or step back, but you cannot stay suspended between fear and hope, pretending the river will carry it all away." The words struck her like stones thrown into the current. They sank deep, stirring unseen depths, and she felt the tension in her body tighten and release all at once. She realized then that perhaps the river had not been her only sanctuary. Perhaps she had not come alone, despite thinking she had. Aita's fingers trembled, but not from cold. Her hand remained in his, held yet neither comforted nor coerced. It was a paradox that made her stomach churn and her mind reel. She wanted to pull away. She wanted to turn her back and finish her ritual, banish him completely. But she could not. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the river and the surrounding plains. A breeze swept across the water, scattering the last remnants of herbs downstream. Aita exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders a mixture of frustration, fear, and something she could not yet name. Kiva did not speak again. He simply let the river flow around them, steady and eternal, waiting. And in that waiting, Aita sensed the beginning of a story neither of them had chosen, yet both would be drawn into whether they wished it or not. The river did not give answers. It did not promise outcomes, but as the water lapped against their ankles, a silent understanding passed between them. The currents of fate had already begun, and neither could step out of the river alone. The sun had climbed higher, scattering light across the desert plains. Yet Aita still lingered by the river, her mind caught between ritual and reality. The herbs had drifted downstream, carried by the steady current, but the sense of release she had expected never came. Instead, the presence of Kiva lingered like a shadow she could not shake. She moved to the riverbank, brushing wet sand from her bare feet, and tried to steady her thoughts. He remained in the water, spear resting casually against his shoulder, his eyes fixed on the flowing river rather than on her. That should have given her relief. It did not. Every muscle in her body tensed at the awareness of him, though nothing about his stance was threatening. For hours they remained near the river, the wind stirring dust across the open plains, carrying with it the scent of sage and earth. Aita tried to perform smaller rites, placing stones in the shape of protective symbols on the riverbank, lighting small bundles of juniper and letting them smolder. She worked quickly, fingers deftly moving despite the simmering frustration that gnawed at her. Kiva observed quietly, stepping closer, only when she moved to the shallows again. "You must rest," he said finally, his voice low, almost reluctant. "The river cannot cleanse what the body refuses to release." She froze. That statement struck closer to truth than she wished to admit. The ritual was supposed to be her alone, private, solemn, sacred. But his words carried weight, carried knowledge she was unwilling to accept. She wanted to brush him off, to insist he had no right to speak, yet a part of her could not. "I do not need your guidance," she said sharply, brushing past him to place another stone along the river's edge. But as she moved, her sandalless feet slipped slightly on the wet stones, and Kiva's hand shot out instinctively, steadying her with a grip that was firm but careful. She yanked back, heart hammering, but his presence did not waver. For the first time, Aita noticed the subtle marks of battle on him, a faint scar across his shoulder, the lean strength in his arms, the way he carried the spear not as a weapon of aggression, but as a symbol of readiness and patience. She did not want to acknowledge it, but the sight stirred a cautious curiosity she could not name. Hours passed like this, with the river flowing between them as both a divider and a silent witness. Aita continued her work, Kiva remained close, and the desert sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over stones and scrub. Not once did he touch her again. Not once did he speak unnecessarily. He simply existed, steady, silent, a presence she could not ignore. At one point, Aita allowed herself to glance at him in a moment of fleeting boldness. Kiva had removed the spear from his shoulder and was now tracing patterns in the sand with the tip of his moccasin. He was quiet, thoughtful, almost meditative, yet she felt a strange pull toward the intensity of his focus. The river rushed at their feet, and the world beyond seemed distant, almost unreal. She shook her head to clear it. The pull of the river was hers, the ritual hers, the solitude hers. She would not let him claim any part of it. And yet, when she raised her hand to scatter a few remaining herbs into the current, she found it steadier when he remained nearby, his gaze fixed on the river rather than on her. Aida did not admit it, but his quiet presence gave her a strange sense of safety, a tether to the earth that neither herbs nor chance could provide. She hated the thought of it, and so she worked faster, scattering the last of the juniper bundles, arranging the stones into neat rows, and finally stepping back to observe the pattern she had created. The wind picked up, carrying sand across the riverbank and ruffling both their hair. Kiva straightened, spear in hand, and said nothing. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the river flowing between them, carrying away both herbs and unspoken words. Then, without warning, a coyote's cry echoed across the plains, sharp and sudden. Aida startled, stumbling slightly, and Kiva's hand moved again, brushing against hers, not gripping, not holding, only a fleeting, instinctive touch as he steadied her. She jerked back, irritation rising, but it was tinged with a reluctant acknowledgement that she had relied on him without intending to. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the river and plains. Aida felt a sudden weariness in her limbs, a heaviness she could not shake despite the ritual's completion. She glanced at Kiva, who was now seated on a nearby rock, spear laid across his lap, staring out at the horizon. He looked as if he belonged there, a fixture of the land, and yet utterly foreign in her personal space. For the first time, she allowed herself a deep breath, acknowledging silently that the river, the stones, the herbs, and even Kiva had shifted something within her. Not her heart, not her thoughts, but something subtler, a tension she could neither name nor ignore. As twilight approached, Aida gathered her remaining belongings and turned to leave the river. Kiva rose as well, stepping into the shallow water to accompany her back toward the bank. Not close, not imposing, but present. She ignored him, forcing her feet to move over sand and stone, but could feel his gaze following her, unwavering. "Patient, you should rest tonight," he said again, softer this time, almost as if speaking to the wind. "The river is done for today, but tomorrow is another day." Aida did not respond. Her jaw set, but she felt the weight of his words. She did not want to admit it aloud, but a small, reluctant part of her acknowledged that perhaps the river would not be enough to carry away what had begun here today. And as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, the desert stretching endlessly around them, she realized that the presence of Kiva, steady, silent, unmoving, was a new current in her life, one she could not yet resist, even if she tried. The slow burn had begun, though neither of them would name it, and the river, once a sanctuary, had become a witness to something neither could yet define. The next morning, a thin mist clung to the river, curling around stones and weaving between the sparse mesquite trees. Aida arrived first, her bare feet sinking into the soft, damp sand, the familiar weight of the pouch of herbs swinging against her hip. She wanted solitude, yet part of her knew, an instinct she could not name, that she would not have it. She set to work immediately, arranging bundles of sage and juniper along the river's edge, muttering incantations under her breath. The river's gentle murmur carried her words downstream, intertwining them with the soft hiss of water over stone. It should have been enough. It had to be enough. But Kiva was already there, waiting on the far side of the river. The mist softened his outline, but she recognized the lean strength in his posture, the way he carried his spear casually, his shoulder-length hair with a few braids damp from morning dew. For a moment she hesitated, torn between irritation and reluctant acknowledgement of his presence. "You are early," she said without turning to him. "I rise with the river," he replied simply, his voice low and steady. "It is good to witness the beginning of things." Aida stiffened. His words were cryptic, as always, but beneath them lay a certainty she could not ignore. She did not answer, focusing on her ritual, scattering the herbs with precision, arranging the stones in the same protective patterns she had made yesterday. The river reflected the pale morning light, and for a while, all was quiet except for the soft lapping of water. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and casting long, bright reflections across the river. Aida noticed Kiva stepping closer, but he did so with a careful patience, never imposing, never speaking unnecessarily. He seemed attuned to the rhythm of the river itself, moving in sync with its flow rather than against it. "Why do you stay?" she asked finally, unable to hold the question in any longer. Her voice was sharper than intended, but the morning's solitude had worn thin against his constant presence. He did not answer immediately. Instead, Kiva knelt near the riverbank, tracing a pattern in the sand with his moccasin. "Because the river is not finished," he said after a long moment, his eyes never leaving the ground. "Neither are we." Aida felt a flicker of irritation. The ritual was hers, her river, her solitude. How could he insist on presence where none was requested? And yet the words struck a subtle chord, deeper than she wished to admit. She ignored the sensation and continued her work, scattering herbs and aligning stones. A sudden gust of wind swept across the river, rustling the mesquite leaves and carrying a few stray herbs downstream. Aida stumbled slightly on the wet stones, and Kiva's hand shot out instinctively, brushing against hers, not gripping, not holding, merely offering balance. She jerked back, irritation flaring, but also a strange warmth she refused to acknowledge. The day wore on. By noon, the sun beat down relentlessly, turning the sand warm beneath their feet. Aida paused to wipe sweat from her brow, and for the first time, she allowed herself to observe Kiva in silence. He was quiet, attentive, yet not intrusive. His movements were precise, careful, almost ritualistic in themselves. She could not deny the efficiency and calmness he brought to the riverbank, even as he remained separate from her, untangled from her work, yet undeniably present. "I should finish alone," she said finally, attempting to reclaim her authority over the ritual. "This is my work, not yours." Kiva's gaze met hers, calm and unwavering. "Perhaps," he said, "but some work cannot be done in isolation. Even the river does not flow without its banks." Aida's jaw tightened. His words were maddeningly true, yet they were not meant to comfort, to charm, or to coerce. They were simply facts delivered with quiet certainty. She wanted to turn away, to insist on her solitude, but the river, the stones, and the lingering scent of herbs made her hesitate. By mid-afternoon, they had both fallen into a quiet rhythm. Aida scattered herbs, arranged stones, and muttered incantations. Kiva moved nearby, his presence a constant but unobtrusive rhythm against the river's flow. Neither spoke unnecessarily, and yet the space between them was charged with subtle tension, an acknowledgement of something neither could name nor define. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Aida began to gather the remaining herbs, preparing to leave. She felt fatigue in her limbs, the weight of ritual and repetition pressing down. When she stepped back, Kiva's eyes followed her, calm and steady. He did not offer words of comfort or approval. He simply existed in the fading light, a presence she could not ignore. For the first time, Aida realized that the river, once a sanctuary for solitude, had become a shared space, a witness to something inchoate yet undeniable. The ritual, the herbs, the flowing water, all were intertwined with the quiet insistence of the man who refused to leave. She did not understand it, and she did not want to. And yet, as they both stood at the river's edge, the first stars beginning to pierce the twilight sky, she sensed that the currents of fate had shifted. Something had begun, subtle and unspoken. Like the slow rise of a tide, she could neither stop nor control. And though neither would admit it aloud, the river had become more than a place of ritual. It had become a threshold, a boundary that neither could cross fully, yet neither could leave behind. The sun had dipped low behind the distant ridges, casting long shadows over the desert plains. Aida moved along the riverbank, her bare feet pressing into the warm sand, the weight of the day heavy in her limbs. She carried the last pouch of herbs carefully, her fingers brushing over the hand-stitched patterns, and her mind turned over the events of the past 2 days. Kiva followed at a measured distance, spear resting lightly in one hand. He did not speak, nor did he intrude, yet his presence was constant, a shadow alongside her, steady as the river itself. She wanted to ignore him, to focus only on her ritual and the remnants of the herbs. But the awareness of him never left her mind. Aita paused by a cluster of stones, carefully arranging a circle of juniper and sage. The desert air was warm and still, carrying the faint scent of herbs and earth. She knelt, her hands moving quickly, trying to finish before the light fully faded. But Kiva stepped closer, kneeling across the circle, his gaze focused on the arrangement rather than on her. "You move too quickly," he said softly, not as a critique, but as an observation. "The river works at its own pace. You cannot force it." Her jaw tightened. "The river is not my master," she said sharply, though the sound of her own voice startled her. The wind shifted, tugging at her hair and the edges of her dress. Kiva did not reply, only nodded once, the gesture subtle yet insistent. They worked in silence for some time, the ritual's completion feeling less like a personal act and more like a shared cadence, a rhythm neither had chosen but both had fallen into. Aida's hands trembled slightly as she placed the final bundle of herbs, the last wisps of smoke curling into the twilight sky. "You must rest tonight," Kiva said again, his voice quieter this time, almost contemplative. "The river has done its part. You must let your body do the rest." Aida shook her head, refusing to acknowledge the fatigue that weighed her down. "I will not rest until I finish what I came to do." "You cannot finish alone," he said simply, the words carrying a weight that made her stomach tighten. "The river cannot hold everything for you. Neither can the earth. You must allow help, even if it is quiet, even if it is unwelcome." Her hands froze over the herbs. She did not want to admit it, but his words resonated. She wanted to be alone, to perform her rites in solitude. But the reality of his presence, steady, patient, unwavering, made her realize that perhaps solitude alone had never been enough. A sudden rustle in the nearby mesquite caught her attention. Aida's muscles tensed, ready to defend herself with the small knife at her hip. Kiva's hand moved instinctively, resting lightly near his spear, eyes scanning the shadows. The rustle resolved into a small desert fox darting across the sand, and Aida exhaled slowly, heart still racing. "You are always prepared," Kiva observed quietly, his gaze returning to her without comment or judgment. "And yet you hesitate." "I do not hesitate," she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. He did not press further. Instead, he stood and began walking along the riverbank, motioning subtly for her to follow. Aida hesitated, then moved after him, bare feet sinking into soft sand and stones, the last traces of daylight brushing their shoulders with gold and crimson. As they walked, the river whispered beside them, carrying the scent of herbs and earth, reflecting the fading light. Neither spoke, but the space between them felt charged, not with attraction, not with affection, but with the awareness of something building, something inevitable. They reached a small grove of trees where the river widened slightly, forming a shallow pool that reflected the twilight sky. Kiva stopped, gesturing toward the water. "Here," he said. "Rest. Let the river hold you tonight, even if only for a while." Aida's hands clenched at her sides. She wanted to refuse, to assert her independence, but the exhaustion she had denied all day pressed heavily on her. Slowly, reluctantly, she knelt by the water's edge, the cool river lapping against her skin, and exhaled. Kiva did not sit beside her. He remained a short distance away, spear resting across his lap, watching the horizon. His presence was constant, steady, unyielding, and yet respectful. Aida realized, with a quiet acknowledgement she did not admit to aloud, that she could not have rested without it. The sun finally disappeared behind the hills, leaving the desert in deepening shades of indigo and violet. The river continued its endless journey, whispering around stones and roots, carrying away smoke, herbs, and unspoken words alike. And in that silence, Aida sensed the beginnings of something neither of them could yet name. An unspoken understanding, a tether forged not by words or gestures, but by the shared presence at the edge of the river. Tonight, she would sleep. Tomorrow the river would flow again, and with it, perhaps, the slow weaving of something neither intended, yet both were already entangled in. The morning sun had not yet broken fully over the horizon, but the desert was already alive with quiet sound. The whisper of wind through the mesquite, the soft rustle of small creatures awakening among the stones, and the distant murmur of the river winding across the plains. Aida had arrived first, as was her habit, moving silently along the bank. Her bare feet pressed into the cool sand, carrying the weight of the previous day's rituals and the lingering tension of Kiva's constant presence. She knelt by the river's edge, arranging the final herbs from the pouch she had carried each morning. Her hands moved with meticulous care, fingers brushing against the smooth stones and wet sand as she aligned them in intricate patterns, tracing protective symbols she had learned as a child from her grandmother. The rising sun painted the scene in soft gold and pink, reflecting off the ripples in the river, and giving the herbs a subtle luminescence. Kiva appeared silently from the path along the riverbank, his medium build framed by the soft glow of dawn. His shoulder-length hair, interwoven with a few braids, caught the light as he moved. He carried his spear loosely, not in a position of threat, but as a natural extension of himself, a tool of readiness, a part of the land he inhabited with ease. He did not speak as he approached, and Aida did not look up. Her focus remained on the ritual, on the herbs, on the stones, but beneath her concentration, a constant awareness of him tugged at her mind. "You work as if the river owes you something," he said softly. Voice low and steady, cutting through the quiet morning without startling her. Aida paused, adjusting a bundle of juniper in the shallow water, and forced her gaze to the horizon. "I do not work for the river," she said, tone firm, though her chest tightened. "I work for what must be done, nothing more." Kiva's expression remained neutral, but there was a weight behind his presence, a quiet insistence that made her chest ache in ways she refused to name. He crouched a few feet away, tracing patterns in the sand with the tip of his moccasin, mirroring the meticulousness of her ritual without imposing on it. The sun climbed higher, and the river reflected the shifting light like molten glass, carrying the smoke of smoldering herbs downstream in a lazy spiral. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional caw of a crow or the whisper of the wind. Aida's hands grew tired, her movements slower, but she did not pause. The ritual demanded precision, and the presence of Kiva, a constant, silent observer, both unnerved her and anchored her. She hated the recognition of the fact that she had begun to rely on it, even in the smallest way. At midday, Aida paused to drink from a small clay water vessel she had brought, the cool liquid sliding down her throat and offering temporary relief from the relentless heat. Kiva, standing a respectful distance away, did the same, his movements deliberate and unhurried. There was a symmetry in their actions, a rhythm of shared existence without words that neither could articulate. "You are always so precise," Kiva remarked after a long pause, his gaze scanning the river rather than resting on her. "Every stone, every herb, all placed with intent. And you are always watching," she shot back, irritation lacing her tone, though her fingers tightened around the water vessel with a subtle tremor, "as if my work requires your approval." He did not respond immediately, only shifted slightly, leaning on his spear. "I do not watch for approval," he said finally, voice even. "I watch because the river is patient, and it allows observation. Some things cannot be forced, they must be tended." Aida's jaw tightened. She hated the calmness of his words, the way they cut through her defenses without effort. She wanted solitude, independence, control, and yet, in some quiet corner of her mind, she acknowledged that the ritual, the river, and even Kiva's silent presence had begun to form a rhythm she could not resist. The wind picked up, brushing across the river and carrying with it the scent of sage and wet sand. Aida's hair whipped around her face and she brushed it back impatiently, her gaze catching the distant hills. Something in the movement of the wind mirrored the tension coiled within her, and she felt her pulse quicken. Kiva's gaze remained steady, calm, unwavering, and utterly undistracted by her fidgeting. "You must rest," he said softly again, the words not a command, but a gentle insistence. "Even the river rests at night. You cannot pour yourself into it endlessly." "I do not need rest," she said sharply, though her voice faltered just slightly. Her fingers shook as she adjusted another bundle of herbs, and for the briefest moment she wanted to admit her exhaustion. But she did not. Pride, habit, and stubbornness held her in place. Kiva did not press further. He simply moved closer, though still at a respectful distance, and set his spear against a stone, allowing the river and her ritual to take center stage. The silence between them was not empty, it was charged, a living thing that hung over the water, the stones, the herbs, and the space they shared. By late afternoon, Aida had begun to pack the remnants of her ritual, the herbs nearly spent, the stones aligned and smoldering slightly from the morning's work. The desert sun began its slow descent, painting the river in gold and rose. Kiva moved beside her then, offering a hand to steady her as she stepped over a slick stone, but she pulled back sharply, refusing even the fleeting contact. "You cannot do everything alone," he said quietly. Almost to himself. "I can," she said, voice tight. "I have done so before. I will do so again." Kiva said nothing, merely nodded, leaving the words hanging in the warm desert air. Aida's chest tightened. She hated that he could remain patient, silent, and still command such power in her mind without moving toward her, without speaking directly to her fears. They reached a small pool where the river widened, water calm and reflective. Aida knelt by its edge, placing the final herbs with care. Kiva knelt nearby, maintaining a space that was close enough to be felt, but distant enough to be unobtrusive. For a long while, they simply existed beside the water. The desert stretched endlessly beyond them, a vast expanse of stone, sand, and mesquite trees. The sun's last rays glimmered across the river, carrying away smoke, herbs, and unspoken words alike. In the silence, Aida realized that the river, once a sanctuary for solitude, had become a shared threshold. The ritual had completed, but the presence of Kiva had altered the landscape of her mind. She could not name it, could not define it, could not admit it aloud, but a slow, persistent current had begun to pull at her, linking her to the man who refused to leave her side. The river bore witness to the tension, the ritual, and the unformed bond that neither Aida nor Kiva fully understood. And as the twilight deepened into night, she sensed the beginning of something inevitable, an undercurrent of connection, patience, and unspoken understanding that would shape the days to come. The desert night stretched wide, the sky a blanket of stars that shimmered above the river and the plains beyond. Aida had made a small fire near the river's edge, its flames flickering and casting dancing shadows across her face. The smell of smoldering sage mingled with the scent of sand and distant mesquite, creating a quiet, sacred space in the darkness. Kiva stood a few paces away, his silhouette outlined by the firelight. The spear in his hand reflected a glint of the flames as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, attentive yet silent. Neither of them spoke for long stretches, and in that silence, the unspoken understanding between them grew, a subtle tether that neither wished to name. Aida stirred the fire with a stick, embers flying into the night. Her heart felt heavy, not from fear, not from anger, but from the unfamiliar weight of Kiva's constant, unwavering presence. She had always relied only on herself, only on her rituals, only on the river. And yet, he had become part of the rhythm, a steady current running alongside her own. "You've been at this for days," he said finally, his voice low and calm, carrying easily over the sound of the river. "Even the river rests. Why do you not?" She clenched her jaw, hesitant to reveal the truth, hesitant to admit her fatigue, her isolation, her reliance. "Because it is not done," she said, voice firm but quiet, the words more for herself than for him. "And neither am I." Kiva's gaze swept across the river, calm and steady, reflecting the starry sky above. He did not press her, did not argue, did not attempt to intrude. His presence alone was an assertion that she could not ignore. Slowly, reluctantly, Aida realized that the ritual, the river, and even the desert night itself had begun to weave them together in a subtle, unspoken alliance. Hours passed. The fire burned low, casting orange and gold across the river's surface. Aida's fingers ached from arranging herbs, her bare feet pressed against the cool sand, and yet she continued her work, scattering a few remaining bundles into the shallow pool. Each movement was precise, almost ritualistic, yet tinged with a growing awareness of Kiva's watchful eyes. You do not have to do this alone, he said quietly, stepping a little closer, but still careful, still respectful of the distance she demanded. I can, she replied sharply, though the tone lacked conviction. Her chest tightened, and for a fleeting moment, she felt a flicker of hesitation, a crack in the armor she had built around herself. She did not look at him, but she felt his presence like a steady stone beside her. Kiva crouched near the edge of the water, careful not to cross into her personal space, and rested a hand lightly on the spear beside him. Even the river needs its banks, he said softly. It flows, but it cannot hold without boundaries. You cannot carry everything alone. Aida's hands froze for a moment, her fingers brushing the smooth stones along the riverbed. She wanted to deny it, to insist on independence and solitude, but the truth weighed heavy on her. She had relied on the river, yes, but she had also begun, however reluctantly, to rely on him. The night deepened. A gentle wind rustled through the mesquite trees, carrying with it the scent of sand, sage, and distant flowers. The river murmured beside them, reflective and unending, a quiet witness to the growing tension. Aida finally allowed herself to sit, cross-legged on the sand, and rest her hands in her lap. Kiva mirrored her, kneeling nearby, maintaining a respectful distance that felt both comforting and frustratingly close. For a long while, they simply existed together, silent, steady, bound by the rituals of the river and the desert night. The unspoken awareness between them grew heavier, more persistent, though neither named it aloud. Aida's heart had not softened. Her trust had not fully formed, but the subtle tether, the invisible line of shared space and silent observation, had strengthened. You will not speak of this, Aida said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, though her gaze remained on the fire. I will not speak, Kiva replied, but I will be here, always. Her jaw tightened, a flush rising in her cheeks. It was not anger, but something more confusing, a mix of frustration, unease, and an acknowledgement of the comfort his presence offered her. She hated how much she depended on the stability he provided, yet she could not deny it. The stars reflected in the river, twinkling and endless, and Aida realized that the desert, the river, and even Kiva had become part of a rhythm she could not ignore. It was not love, not yet. It was something quieter, slower, and deeper, a recognition of trust, a tether of shared experience, a rhythm that had begun to pull them together in subtle, unyielding ways. The fire burned lower still, shadows stretching across the sand and water. Aida closed her eyes briefly, letting the exhaustion of the day press against her, and for the first time, allowed herself to feel the strange comfort in Kiva's silent presence. The river flowed beside them, carrying away smoke, herbs, and unspoken words alike, a living witness to the slow burn that neither of them would yet name. And as the desert night stretched on, the bond, unseen, unacknowledged, yet undeniable, continued to grow, weaving them together with quiet patience and unwavering presence. The river flowed quietly in the early morning, its surface smooth and glassy, reflecting the first light of dawn. The desert around it was still, except for the occasional rustle of mesquite leaves and the distant call of a hawk. Aida stood barefoot in the shallow water, her ankle-length hand-stitched dress brushing against the gentle current. The pouch of herbs rested against her hip, a reminder of her rituals, her intentions, and her solitary resolve. She breathed deeply, feeling the river cold against her skin, and whispered words she had spoken many times before. Words meant to banish, to cleanse, to protect herself from what she could not control. She had expected the river to respond with silence, with the neutrality of water and stone. But today felt different. Something in the air was heavier, charged, electric in its stillness. A sudden movement behind her drew her attention, and she turned sharply. Kiva stood at the edge of the riverbank, spear resting against his shoulder, his medium build steady and unwavering. His shoulder-length hair, interwoven with a few braids, was damp from the morning dew. The firelight of the past nights had long faded, replaced now by the soft gold of dawn, yet he was unmistakably present, an unmovable part of the landscape she had once claimed for herself alone. "Why are you here?" she demanded, voice trembling slightly despite her effort to remain firm. "I told you to leave. This is my ritual. I do not need you." Kiva's gaze did not waver. He stepped closer, carefully, deliberately, closing the distance without breaking her boundaries. His presence alone carried a quiet insistence that left her heart pounding in a way she could neither control nor fully understand. "I am here," he said softly, "because the river allows it. Because you allowed it, without knowing it. And because I will not leave you to do this alone." Aita's hands clenched into fists at her sides, the herb swinging lightly against her dress. Her chest heaved with frustration, with fear, with something unfamiliar stirring beneath the surface. She had prided herself on independence, on solitude, on control. But Kiva's unwavering presence challenged all of it. The river rippled around her ankles as she took a tentative step back, attempting to reclaim her space. Kiva moved in tandem, stopping just short of reaching her, a quiet tension suspended between them. Then, without another word, he extended a hand, not in demand, not in possession, but in offering. For a heartbeat, Aita froze. Her instinct screamed to pull away, to reject, to assert her autonomy. And yet, there was something in his steady gaze, something in the calm certainty of his presence, that made her hesitate. She looked at the hand, then at his face, then down at the river swirling around her feet. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, unyielding, but gentle enough to respect her boundaries. He did not pull her toward him, nor did he speak. He simply held her hand as if to anchor both of them to this moment, to the river, to the truth that had been building silently for days. The wind shifted, stirring the mesquite leaves and carrying with it the scent of sage, herbs, and earth. Aita felt a strange and unfamiliar calm settle in her chest, a quiet acknowledgement of something she had denied herself. Trust, patience, and the presence of another soul steadfast beside her. They remained in the river, hand in hand as the sun rose higher, painting the desert in gold and rose. Neither spoke, neither moved. The river flowed around them, indifferent and eternal, yet a silent witness to the bond that had formed in quiet, slow increments over days of shared ritual, of subtle observation, and of unspoken understanding. Aita's gaze drifted to the river's far bank, then back at Kiva. She could not name what this was. Not love. Not yet, not entirely. But it was something undeniable, something persistent, something that had refused to be banished by ritual or intention. And Kiva, medium build, shoulder-length hair with a few braids, spear resting lightly at his side, stood unwavering, his hand still holding hers, a steady presence in the flowing water, a quiet assertion that he would not let go, that he would not be dismissed, that he would remain. For the first time in days, Aita allowed herself to breathe fully, to feel the warmth of connection without fear, to acknowledge the slow burn that had been building between them. The river carried away smoke, herbs, and unspoken words alike, leaving only the current, the water, and the tether that now bound them, quietly, inevitably, irrevocably. The desert stretched around them, vast, unending, and yet in that small flowing ribbon of water, Aita realized that she was no longer alone, and for the first time, she did not want to be.